everyone. Welcome to our next education webinar. We're very excited to have you joining us here today. As we're just letting a few people enter in and sort of trickle in, I'll just, if you'd like to share which country you're tuning in from in the chat. I am tuning in from beautiful Wurundjeri country. We're very lucky and privileged to live and work on Wurundjeri country. I see someone's coming in from Bunurong. Jaja Wurrung. Awesome. Oh, oh. All right. Well, as we're sort of allowing a few people to come in, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Claire Hyatt and I'm a proud Gunai Kurnai woman. I'm the project support officer here at Reconciliation Victoria, and I've been working here for about a year now. And I'm really passionate about this space in particular. It was something that I didn't get to have in school. I didn't get that education in school around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and culture. So I'm really passionate about ensuring that our educators today have the knowledge and the skill and the confidence to teach students. So I'm really glad that you're all joining us here today. And obviously it's a very important topic that we are focusing on. I'd just like to start today's presentation by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm coming in from today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and to their young leaders who are coming through today and continuing that culture, education and learning from their elders as well. I'd like to acknowledge the continuing connection that the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people have to the land, sky and waters here in this place, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across what we now call Australia, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I'd also like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So thank you all for joining us. We are very excited to have joining us today Rueben Berg, who is the newly elected co-chair of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, and we're really thankful for him for joining us today. I might pass over to you, Rueben, so you can have a chat and tell us a bit more about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Claire. Nyapta Gunitamara, Nyaptu Nyap Linyong Rueben Berg. As Claire said, my name's Rueben Berg. I'm a proud Gunitamara man, joining you here today also from the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples. And I've just been recently elected as a co-chair for the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. I was previously on the Assembly as a general member for the previous term of the Assembly and was fortunate enough to get re-elected onto the Assembly, this time as a representative for Eastern Maar, and then to be selected by Chamber alongside Ngara Murray to be one of the co-chairs of the Assembly.
Awesome. That's so exciting. And I know you mentioned you'd just come back from your first sort of treaty negotiations, which is just amazing. And as a young First Nations person myself, it's just very exciting to hear that that's all happening and that progress is there. All right, so we'll jump in just before we start today's chat. I'd just like to share we will be using the software Mentimeter. We've been using these previously in our other webinars, so you may be familiar with it. But we've got two of these today. So I'm gonna start it now, and then, or maybe not. Oh, looks like it's not going to work for me actually. So we might just jump straight through to the questions to start with. So Rueben, could you describe what the voice to Parliament is for us here in Victoria, here in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a proposal at the moment that's going to be decided in a referendum for a voice to Parliament. And basically what it is going to be establishing an advisory voice, a collection of First Peoples from across the nation. There's no confirmation yet about exactly how that group will come together, how they'll be selected, but there will be a process to select First Peoples from all across the nation. And that group, that voice, will then provide advice to the government on things that affect them. And that advice will be non-binding advice. It will be up to the government to decide how they want to use that advice. But it is an advisory body to government enshrined within the Constitution. That's what the voice is at a simple level.
Mm. And can you explain why it's important that the voice to Parliament is recognised in the Constitution?
Yeah, absolutely. So there has been previous examples of advisory bodies, even decision-making bodies actually at a national level, like ATSIC, the former Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. That was a democratically elected group of First Peoples who actually had decision-making powers granted to them by the Commonwealth. We also had the First Nations Congress. There's been many similar bodies across the years, but what we've found with those, the reality has been that they're in place at the whims of the politicians of the day. And so if the politicians decide that they don't like the advice they're getting, or they no longer want such a body to exist, they can just remove it because those previous bodies were just within legislation or just corporate entities. And so to make sure that that can't happen in the future, we need this body enshrined within the Constitution. So that was the request that came from First Peoples who gathered for the Uluru Statement. They said, we want this to be in the Constitution. And that's why it's so important, is so that it's no longer at the whims of the politicians of the day. It becomes an enduring part of our democracy here in Australia.
And that Uluru Statement, that was quite significant in forming the idea behind the voice. Could you, we may or may not have some participants who are aware of that. Could you just give a little bit of background around that?
Yeah, so the Uluru Statement is a very powerful short statement, not a lengthy multi-page statement. It's a short statement that came about on lots of conversations across a number of years that were specifically around at the time, just the idea of recognition. So you might recall back the Recognise campaign, where there was that desire to see how the Constitution could be amended to recognise First Peoples within that. And so there were lots of dialogues that happened all across the nation, lots of regional dialogues in the cities, lots of different groups, lots of diverse views from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that then culminated in this gathering at Uluru. And out of that came this view that, no, we don't just want to be recognised in the Constitution, we want something more than that. And the key aspects of that Uluru Statement was that there should be a voice enshrined within the Constitution, but there should also be progress made towards truth-telling and agreement making, or treaty as we come to refer to it now. And those three aspects, voice, treaty, truth, kind of the high level summary of that Uluru Statement from the heart that came about from lots of diverse views from within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community.
Yeah, and I think leading off of that, we're quite unique here in Victoria in the sense that we have both the Uric Justice Commission, Truth-Telling Commission, and as we mentioned, the First Peoples Assembly and Treaty Advancement occurring. So I suppose in the Victorian landscape, how is the voice to Parliament aligning with those policy developments that are taking place?
Yeah, so we like to look at it that at the moment here in Victoria, we essentially already have a voice. The First Peoples Assembly, we are a democratically elected group. There are two forms of members. There's members who are elected by different regions, by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples voting within those regions. And then there's also members appointed by their traditional owner groups. They get to appoint representatives as well. So we are a democratically elected group, and we provide advice through the government about various things. And we are the lead on negotiating treaty with the government. So we are fulfilling that function here in Victoria, but it's completely compatible with the conversation around a national voice. So I mentioned earlier that the idea of a national voice, there's not confirmed detail about exactly how that would operate, but the design principles that have been agreed to, that sit behind the work that's already gone on, state very clearly that whatever proposal is going to be moving forward must recognise existing structures. And so the Assembly is an existing structure here in Victoria of how we have chosen to come together as First Peoples. And so it seems very clear and logical to think that the Assembly can operate as a voice to the Victorian government, but will also be able to operate as a voice to the Commonwealth level. And there's lots of ways that could work, but they are completely compatible and they work in parallel, essentially, the idea of the role of the Assembly here in Victoria and how that would operate at a national level through the voice.
Yeah, all right. I might just try and get this little Menti going one more time. If it doesn't work, we can forget about it. Here we go. Oh, awesome. All right. So off of the back of that conversation, sort of let's giving a bit of a background behind the voice. I'd now like to ask the audience how you feel you would describe your level of understanding around the voice to Parliament. So you can join using the code up on the screen, or you can scan this QR code as well here and enter that. So I'll give you a few minutes just to log in and have a look. We've got a high level of knowledge, a medium level of knowledge, low level, or if you feel like you really don't know, then you can put those as well. And we'll have a look. Yeah, awesome. Looks like you're all majority sort of sitting in that medium level. There are a lot of resources out there at the moment, which I'm sure you've all been reading and having a look at. Awesome. All right. Well, as you're putting up those, you're welcome to continue entering your answers into there. I'll move on to some next questions for Rueben. Now, I think obviously we can agree that there's been a fair bit of information and a lot of talk out there around the voice. And I suppose I just want to address and ask you, like, that, you know, there has been some concerns that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are divided on the need for the voice. Do you think you could talk a little bit more about this, or talk to this a little bit around that concern around the divide?
Yeah, absolutely. And the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community here in Australia and here in different states and different regions, we're like any community, there's diversity. There's not one unified view held by all Aboriginal peoples. We have diversity within our communities. And so it's no surprise that on this particular topic, there's also diversity of views. But I think there's some important ways to look at this conversation as well. The polling that has been done, and you can find the details of the polls online, have shown overwhelming support from First Peoples for this. I think about 80% have shown support for this idea, and lots of other Aboriginal organisations out there. We see lots of Aboriginal people out there advocating for the voice. So there is, I think, really strong support amongst the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community for the voice. But there is diversity. There are some people with different perspectives, and there's lots of different underlying reasons why many people might have different perspectives on that. But I think one of the difficulties we're seeing at the moment within the media landscape is that there almost seems to be an even representation of those views within the media landscape, that there are some quite prominent and loud, outspoken members of the community who don't support the voice, and they seem to be given equal weight as if it is a 50-50 proposition, but that's not the reality for where I sit. And here within the Assembly, we have overwhelming support for the voice. And whenever I go and do engagements, I see overwhelming support for the voice from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. I think it's also really quite interesting, though, to think about this idea that there is this big referendum coming up, and there is this keenness from people, understandably, to try and think, well, this is going to be something that's going to have a big impact on Aboriginal people. So they'd really like to know what Aboriginal people think about that idea. And to me, there's a sense of irony there, because wouldn't it be useful if there was a formal way we could get Aboriginal people to come together and understand what their views were before an important decision was made about them? That's what the voice is about. That very idea of wanting to know what Aboriginal people think about this shows to me that that's why we need a voice. So we can have this way of not just the loudest person gets to be heard, but a proper process so that that diversity of Aboriginal views can be brought together and have input on the things that are going to affect them. So I think it's really important that people do want to consider what those perspectives are of the diverse views. And that's why we need a voice, to have a formal mechanism to bring those views together and have that input on things that will affect First Peoples beyond just this referendum.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important to be able to have that. And I think I always think back to the Uluru Statement itself, in that we are such a diverse group of nations and individuals across the country, but it was all, we came together and made that decision together. That voice, treaty and truth was what we needed from this. So yeah, it's really important to be able to have those conversations that acknowledge that diversity, but also, yeah, recognizing, as you say, that the majority are in support. I guess another concern that we are seeing in the media in a sort of similar way is that concern that the voice to Parliament will divide us as a nation. Would you be able to share some of your thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tricky one, that one, because on the surface of it, you can see why people might jump to that idea around this concept of there being division within this. But I truly do see it as a way of bringing us together as a nation, that we do need to reconcile with what has happened in the past, and there is much greater acknowledgement now of what has happened in the past. And the reality of what has happened in the past is that there is significant discrepancies in the outcomes of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community compared to the rest of the community. And if we do want to bring our communities together, we need to make sure that everyone has the same opportunities to succeed. And having a voice is one of those mechanisms to make sure that we can bring our nation together so that everybody does have that same chance to succeed. But the reality is that right now, the Commonwealth Government makes a whole suite of different laws and rules about First Peoples. And it seems only fair that if the government's going to make those decisions, that they have a formal mechanism to ensure they're listening to the voice of First Peoples, because we only represent 3% of the entire nation. So we're not the ones who get to choose those politicians. So we don't necessarily have the same say on what those laws are going to be, but through a voice, we will have that. And I think it will be a thing that can unify us in that way, by ensuring that everyone has a chance to succeed in this nation. I think that's something we're all striving for.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. What we might do is just jump into our next Mentimeter, and we're going to sort of switch the focus now a little bit to more about how we can start to talk about the voice to Parliament in the classroom and with our students and wider school communities. So I'll just ask our audience now to answer this question up on the screen. So how confident do you feel about teaching about or around the voice to Parliament in the classroom? And I'll pop the little QR code up there. Yes, not confident, a few somewhat, a couple very, that's awesome, very confident. And just while you're doing that, I've just seen that we've got a question here from John in the Q&A that I might ask and put to you, Rueben. So we've got, John said that he doesn't really consume much mainstream media and personally can't think of any reason why the voice to Parliament shouldn't exist. So he's asked, what has the media been saying that is untrue or shows a lack of understanding as to what the voice to Parliament aims to be? And thanks, John, for putting in that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there has been lots of different arguments raised in terms of the opposition of this referendum. And I'll touch on some of those, I guess, and give some of the counters to that from my perspective at the very least. Some of it has been this kind of slogan that's been bandied about, is this idea that there's not enough detail. And so the idea is if you don't know, vote no. That's kind of the slogan that has been put out there. And the reality is that there is a lot of detail out there. There is the actual wording of the proposal, which has got the information that we really do need if we're going to vote on it, to know what the wording is. And that's not an extensive list of things, because the Constitution is not the place where all the detail is supposed to sit. There is detail that does sit behind it, though. There are some design principles that have been agreed to by the people working on this that has a significant amount of the detail about what the next phase might look like, but it's not binding on what it would look like, because we need to have this referendum to be successful to know that this process will move forward. And once the referendum is successful, that's when the detail will start to be determined. And that's the role of our politicians, to determine that detail. We don't go out to referendums on every little minor change that happens in our laws. That's the role of our politicians. And we have a say on what those laws are by electing our representatives. So that's one of the issues that is raised, that there's not enough detail. And the reality is there is some detail, but also the Constitution is not the place where that detail should sit. There's also been some concerns raised, particularly from First Peoples who might have concerns around the voice, around the issue of sovereignty, and that somehow the sovereignty of First Peoples might be impacted, that by being recognised within the Constitution and having a formally recognised voice, that might actually limit the powers that we might have as First Peoples. And from all the experts that I've heard in this space, that's not the case. And a clear example of why that's not the case is that here in Victoria, the Constitution was amended several years ago now to formally recognise First Peoples, and that has not in any way inhibited our rights as First Peoples to be negotiating a treaty. So I don't think there is any concern around sovereignty. There's also some concerns raised that we don't need to have a referendum, that we could just do this anyway. And it is true, we could do it anyway, but the Uluru Statement has asked for it to be in the Constitution. And as I said before, we need it to be in the Constitution, so it can't just be dismissed at the whims of the politicians. There's also been concerns people have raised similar to this kind of unifying element, that it kind of re-racializes the nation by having this dedicated voice. But I think that, as I said before, if the government is going to be making policies and laws that directly affect Aboriginal people, it seems only fair to be able to have a direct voice on those things that will directly affect us. So that's some of the propositions that are out there raising concern.
Yeah, thanks for answering that, Rueben. And I hope, John, that answered a little bit of your question. I guess regardless of whether you are consuming a bit of media or you aren't, it's good to sort of to know what those arguments are and be aware of them, and then take that time to actually listen or do your own research around it, and understand where they're coming from. So thank you, Rueben, for sharing those with us. And then I guess this sort of leads into this question more focused on our schools and for our students is, with those sorts of arguments in mind and with a lot of information that's out there, how can we talk about the voice to Parliament with students and within your wider school community? Do you have any thoughts on that, Rueben?
Yeah, so I think there's some really powerful things that can be done within schools, and obviously depending on the level of the schooling and all those sorts of things as appropriate. But I think some really powerful things that could be done is actually reading out what is the proposal, really touching base on the tangible things that are out there. So reading through what the exact proposal is of what will be changed within the Constitution, and understanding that within the broader context of the Constitution. I think this is a useful way to just understand what the Australian Constitution is in the first place, but actually making sure that students know what the proposal really is, as distinct from how it might be portrayed within the media landscape. Another really foundational thing for students to be able to read through and unpick and understand what they think about the statement would be reading the Uluru Statement of the Heart. It's not a long thing to read through. And I think students could gain a lot from actually reading through that statement and unpacking various parts of that and talking about why certain things might be said within that statement. There is also now the official pamphlets from each side. So there is a yes pamphlet and there is a no pamphlet. And that, again, is another useful resource that I would suggest to be able to go to and have a look through and get students to analyse the different propositions that are put within that and give their perspective on the merits of the various arguments that are raised within that. Also, in terms of a more pro-voice analysis, the Yes 23 has some really useful information on its frequently asked questions site, and that addresses many of the kind of general concerns that are raised, and that could be a useful thing as well for students to look through and analyse those things as whether they do seem like sufficient responses to some of those frequently asked questions. So I think going to the source, the top level source information, like the proposal, like the Uluru Statement itself, the yes and the no pamphlets, I think that's a really powerful way to be able to have those conversations to kind of filter out some of just the opinion pieces that sit over the top of things, but go to those source documents. I think that would be a really useful starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other consideration for our educators here today is obviously you're working with majority of the students aren't able to vote or have a say in this referendum. And I suppose that there are ways that students, maybe particularly high school students, can be engaged in these conversations, and especially our First Nations students as well. Are they, the youth dialogues and things like that?
Yeah, there's a whole range of stuff that's happening, and there's lots of opportunities if students do want to be more active involved in this space. And I think even though many students won't be able to actually participate in the vote, they should be great if they have the information to have the conversations with their family around what is going on and understand their family's perspectives on things, not necessarily in a judgmental way, because I don't think that's necessarily useful, but to be able to bring that foundational knowledge about the actual proposal, about the statement itself, and about those pamphlets, to bring that conversation into their family homes. The one thing I think is really important to be mindful of as well, if there are First Nations students within schools, that they might be comfortable to talk about it and share their perspective on these things, but there should never be any pressure on them to have to represent their views or any expectation on them that they have to hold a certain position as well, because this is having a big burden on all of us as First Peoples, and we wouldn't want to increase that burden by schools putting undue expectations on the students in terms of First Nations students on their expectations about how they should engage. I just want to add to as well, the other consideration I think for students is just to try and personalize this conversation as well. Of oftentimes for students, they do kind of feel powerless, that it's always someone else making the rules for them, and to think about how it might be beneficial for any context, that for any group of people, when there's someone else making all the rules for them, how much better that would be when that group could have a say on what those rules could be. And that's something that I think students would easily grab onto, the idea that there'd probably be better outcomes if they could have a direct voice on some of the things that impact on them. And that can be a good parallel to what's going on with this referendum.
Yeah, absolutely.
That might cause a revolt within the school. I'm not necessarily advocating for that, but useful conversation.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really nice way for all the students, whether they're First Nations or not, to relate and understand. I think that's a good analysis. All right, well, I think we'll just have one more of our sort of formal questions, and then I think we might give the audience a chance just to ask a few questions, if you're okay with that, Rueben. So the last question I just wanted to ask, and you've kind of touched on it already, but what would a key piece of advice be for our teachers here today? What advice would a key piece of advice you'd like to pass to our teachers that are here with us today?
Yeah, I think it goes back to those things I touched on about making sure we're referencing those foundational documents. Like that's what educators can do, is to give them the information that's that foundational level, the actual proposal, and make sure there's an analysis of what really is being proposed. So just kind of strip away some of the different rhetoric that might sit behind it, and make sure that the conversation is about what the actual proposal is. I think that's a really powerful thing to be able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. All right, well, I'll give some people, if you would like to ask a question, you're welcome to put it into the chat now. Depending on how many we get, we may not get to all of them. But we've got one here from Susan, and they've asked, if when we talk about the Constitution and the separation of powers, where will the Indigenous voice to Parliament sit within that?
Yeah, so there's not a third chamber of Parliament. None of that sort of stuff that was initially put out there around what the voice proposal is accurate. There's no change to the idea that there's a Senate and a House of Representatives. That's all still in place, because this voice is just an advisory voice. It has no authoritative powers. It has no power of veto. It can't pass laws. It's not an element of the Parliament. It will likely have a place that it's going to meet, and I would think it will probably move all around the nation, just like we have done as the Assembly. We don't have one fixed place that we have our meetings. we know the importance of that regional engagement. So we actually move our meetings all around the state, but I would imagine the Voice would do a similar thing of moving around. So I wouldn't imagine it's going to be one fixed place, but it's also doesn't have that same relationship to the Parliament in terms of the upper house and the lower house. It's just an advisory body. It could just sit in an office somewhere if it needed to. It won't be have that level of formal status to have a new chamber of Parliament built for it.
Yeah, all right. Awesome, thank you. All right, I think that we might end it there. And yeah, I'll just flag, thank you to Lisa Maloney, who's just shared in the chat as well, to consider the cultural safety and load of our First Nations people in your school and community. And she's linked some resources there, which is great. I'll also flag that Reconciliation Victoria, we will be sending out a resource sheet in follow-up to this webinar with all those sorts of pamphlets and information that we've mentioned today with you all. Look, thank you so much for coming into this conversation with us today, Rueben. We really appreciate it. And you've really answered our questions very clearly and concisely, and it's really helpful. It's been extremely helpful for me, and I'm sure really helpful for our audience. So really appreciate your time today, particularly with all the other amazing things that you're busy doing as well. Yeah.
It's been my pleasure, and it's just always great to get more information out there and just really encourage people to go to those source resources to be able to learn more.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just share quickly with our educators here and our audience that RecVic has also just launched our membership platform, which is really exciting. And this platform, there's a specific sign up for educators, and it means you'll be able to access a certain part of the platform, which you'll be able to get access to these sorts of webinars, plus a whole heap of resources that we've been busy putting together that you can use in the classroom and just for your own professional development as well. And hopefully to be able to build a bit of a network of within our educators as well. So the QR code's up there on the screen. Otherwise, you can go to www.recvicmembers.org.au and sign up there as well. But otherwise, that's all for today. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you've got a lot out of it. And yeah, thanks again, Rueben, for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you.